This is a video requested of me by someone who had watched one of my older videos from 3 years ago, comparing my Fiore experience to my Kenjutsu experience. In that video, I concluded at that time that each had their own benefits and weaknesses, but the differences lay in the mindsets. Fiore, or at least as how many modern hema practitioners do it, was about fighting to preserve your life in a hyper-violent Renaissance Italian city-state, while Kenjutsu was about the sole focus of cutting down your enemy in front of you, developed over centuries of warfare in Japan before the Tokugawa shogunate finally and ruthlessly stabilized the country and brought about 150 years of peace. And largely, those feelings remain the same. What I am finding that has changed, however, has been my perspective on how to view these martial arts. Initially, I had thought of them, and other styles as well, as a hard, restrictive box. But I have since learned to incorporate many of each of their elements into more or less my own form. Now, don't get it twisted, I'm not saying that I had created a new sword style, but just figuring out what works best for me using the Fiore style. I found that my main struggle with Fiore guards was that they were too easily telegraphed for someone of my large size, or at least against someone who was already familiar with the system. I had been told, of course, to give it some time, but my nature is to try and work something that wasn't working for me into something that does. And what came out of that was a Fiore system based more on deception and mental manipulation than on particular style, clean swordsmanship per se, and survival, I guess you could say. One can figure out various attack angles with simple geometry, and the user would be reliant upon good footwork, solid structure, and speed in the classical system, as I understood it. But being a bigger person with more mass, how these elements came together in that system just wasn't working. But what did work was when I took those same stances as a starting point and then started using alternative angles of attack instead of the classic ones, the ones that were proper and, for lack of better words, biblical. Some of these came from experiments in combat, while others came from bringing in other elements into my use of the style. From what I'm told, if you hadn't fought me beforehand, it was near impossible to know what exactly I was going to do, throwing off their mental game and anticipation in terms of developing counters before the battle actually began. That being said, those who had fought me before knew my behavior patterns, as it were, and as such were able to create counters, but neither of us were always successful. Perhaps the biggest weakness I saw in how the style is taught in modern times, though, is how many practitioners don't teach the close-in CQC techniques. Techniques that won about half of my victories, if I'm honest, while I was at the school where it was being taught to me, as well as local tournaments and friends that I had fought. And I think it was a difference of mindset, as I had said before. They usually tend to fight as they're going to a tournament, tap each other and basically walk away, and don't get hit in the process. However, I fought to hit and keep going until I felt I was pushing the limits of excessive force or putting the person in legitimate danger. And I never crossed that line, which I'm very proud to say. As physical as I could be, I never knocked anybody out, nor caused anyone to bleed. This segues into my Kenjutsu experience, actually. I had to pressure test on my own the techniques that I had studied and read about. And when applying those techniques against different weapons and fighting systems, quite frankly, some of them just didn't work. And believe me, I got plenty of criticism from saying, well, you weren't using two hands, I was having my shoulders too forward, or whatever the case was. But I can guarantee you, a Kenjutsu master against a rapier master is going to have a serious problem. Which isn't just to say that they suck per se, though. Rather, they just work within specific contexts, and that context needs to present itself or be created by me somehow in order for it to work. Again, against a rapier and a longsword, as I said before, what often had worked best was switching in and out between one and two-handed techniques, as well as incorporating an adaptation of movement based on the type of the person I was fighting. Sometimes I was very still, like a rock, because the other person was just overly excited and aggressive, and I found I had to do very little. Other times I found that moving more was more beneficial, and to that, because of the styles I had studied didn't really do that as much, I usually brought in some stuff from historical African martial arts. And while I did find more success there, I oftentimes still found myself getting sniped in the head by longer rapier experts, or getting hand sniped by longsword users who had learned to keep their distance from me and be more defensive-minded rather than offense-minded, which is where I usually schooled them. All that being said, I suppose my biggest issue wasn't the styles themselves, but the attitude that often surrounds them, and I'm talking about both here. It's one that many martial artists I think are very guilty, in my opinion, but especially with styles that were extinct for a while or came from cultures that were oppressed for long periods of time and told that anything native to them basically sucked and was inferior. These circumstances often produced a inferiority complex, as it were, a need to protect the purity of the style, for lack of better words. Change was limited, and I found myself asking why not work these different elements in when the taught method isn't being as effective as it's supposed to be. So, having said all that, currently right now I am at the conclusion that I said before in recent videos, that the only pure martial arts style is a dead one, because it is no longer subject to the pressures of change. And I think this was true in their heyday as well, as no matter the era, everyone fought with some different style for whatever reason, and that the style had already changed once it was taught to one other person, just one. Evolution is inevitable, and when it doesn't happen, the style stagnates, as, surprisingly to me, many other HEMA people have told me in private. And a side note, this was also one of the reasons why I was drawn to lightsaber combat sport as well, which I already did a video on that, because those various real-life styles could be brought together under the umbrella of a fictional fighting style, so that in the person's mind, they weren't breaking any taboos, nor feeling any kind of pressure to become a master, as it were. In fact, I'm told by other people who teach lightsaber combat, who are proficient in other real-life styles, that oftentimes the hindrance that their students face was the feeling that they had to be masters of some other style in order to learn lightsaber combat, when in fact they didn't. And once they got past that mental mindset, then it just became easier to them, to the point where they actually started studying real-life styles to become better at lightsaber combat, and it became more easier to them and less intimidating. Again, back to that point in that video, that even lightsaber combat can be used to inspire or teach real-life styles. But beyond that, those are my thoughts and updates of sword fighting.